Great. Thank you everyone for turning up for Dylan's talk. Obviously named more than a few days ago with the tail between its NEG. I saw a tweet yesterday from Josh Frydenberg that was exactly 2 weeks old, congratulating his party room for giving overwhelming support for the NEG. This is only 2 weeks ago. Overwhelming support, and it was now up to the states to step forward and do their bit on the NEG. Ironically, that's exactly what is happening. The states, whether it's Victoria with a whole range of programs, not only the 2.6 gigawatts of solar that they just announced to put on rooftops, but the Victorian renewable energy target to take Victoria to 40% renewable by 2025. Queensland's got its QRET. New South Wales just announced the first stages of a bunch of energy efficiency projects, small but important steps. South Australia is proceeding ahead with the virtual power plant, putting solar and batteries on 50,000 houses, starting with low-income houses, and it's an amazing project in that it delivers benefits to the grid, a new business model for retailers, power savings for households, environmental outcomes. It's one of the first projects I've ever seen. It's a win-win-win-win-win. So each of the states has, well, most of the states have a policy, and we're at this very strange period. We've been here a few times in the last decade where we once again have no federal policy on energy and climate, and it looks like there's not going to be a great impetus to have one anytime soon. But things are moving very fast, or have been moving very fast in policy around energy, or at least attempted policy formation really over the 2 years. It's nearly 2 years since the South Australian blackout, when the grid became politicised as never before. Straight after that, the blackout, it was COAG that commissioned the Finkel review. COAG came together and commissioned Finkel to say, okay, what's happening with our grid? What are your recommendations? And that's what started off then the Federal Energy Minister got involved in it, and that's what started off first. There's an emission intensity scheme that got canned. There was a clean energy target, which was, I guess, sort of an iteration of the renewable energy target that got canned, and the NEG, which just got canned beginning of last week. So we've gone through a period where politicians have been on the radio multiple times a week telling us what should be done in our grid. Meanwhile, we have a very well developed group of regulatory agencies. So we've got the Australian Energy Market Operator who runs the grid. We've got the Energy Regulator who enforces the rules, and the Australian Energy Market Commissions that makes the rules. They've been working on the NEM for 20 years now. They're the ones who keep the lights on, and through all this politicisation, they're the ones who are keeping the grid going. So Dylan's been watching the NEM very closely for how long now, Dylan?
About 8 years.
Sorry?
About 8 years.
About 8 years, and there are very few people in the country who understand what's going on in the market, both from what's happening at the generation level, what's happening at the political level, the regulatory. If I've ever got a question about the national electricity rules or the laws, or particular conventions or regulations, Dylan's my go-to guy, and he's the go-to guy of many of the journalists who have been writing sense about energy over the last few years. So it's a wonderful asset we have here at Melbourne University to have Dylan. So I know that Dylan's going to talk about more than just the NEG. There's been a lot of interventions into the market from both at the operational level, but at the political level over the last few years. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing, hearing Dylan's take on it, because it's going to be enlightening and accurate. Great. Thanks, over to you, Dylan.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Simon. It's been a sort of interesting couple of weeks, that's for sure. Before I get started, I just, I guess, like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people and pay respects to their elders, past and present, and any elders that may be in the room with us today or emerging. Yeah, so I did a sort of similar presentation to this a couple of weeks ago up in Sydney. I think it was about 3 days before the NEG died. And during that week, the presentation changed 3 times because of various manifestations that you know, were occurring. But basically today I'm going to talk a bit more broadly than the NEG, talking about some of the things that have, I guess, happened over the last, particularly the last 2 years, to some extent stemming from the System Black in South Australia, but also some of the more recent things that have been occurring around AEMO interventions and the ACCC recommendations, and sort of, I guess, thinking about the implications for these particular interventions and what they mean for how the market's working, or what they mean for the future of our market design. Some of this is very much you know, preliminary thoughts and observations, and I don't necessarily agree with everything that I might say, but there's some things in here that I think are worth thinking about if we're going to, I guess, yeah, that are worth being aware of as the market evolves and as new technologies come into the system or new political interventions are occurring. This is a point I like to make whenever I talk about the national electricity market. This is from a quote from Stephen King, the Australian energy regulator, Stephen King, not the other. So this is I think he used to work for the WA regulatory authority, but basically this is a critical point to understand whenever you're talking about the electricity market or the entire system, is that it is you know, essentially a game that has been constructed. It's not a sort of very natural market in any sense of the word. It's you know, it's a synthetic market that was created by microeconomists sort of in the late 70s, early 80s, you know. And so every time you participate, every time this system is operating and being used, it's essentially you're part of a system that has been constructed. It's not, I mean, to some extent, all markets are constructed, but in the case of the electricity market, they are particularly constructed. And if anyone's familiar with the rules, they're about 1,400 pages long. They're constantly evolving, and there's it's very important to understand that this is not just a pure market. It is a socio-technical system that has, you know, a very strong political dimension to it. So this is, I'm going to go through a few political interventions that have sort of happened over the last 3 or 4 years. So some of these ones here, I've just called Act 1, these actually sort of started or occurred independently of the System Black. Certainly the ACT reverse auction scheme has been in for a long time. Victorian renewable energy target has been, I think it's probably legislated about 2 years ago. Oh, sorry, no, it was originally, actually, I'm not sure on the timeline on that one, but these were outside of the sort of the crisis that was occurred out of the South Australian system. Now these, in some respect, I mean, these came on top of this regulatory framework and this market. These were outside, and these were partly due to basically a failure of emissions policy at federal level. Basically, the fact that the renewable energy target was going to be run out in 2020, the fact that we don't have a carbon price, or there was no particularly coherent policy at a national level, was the driver behind a lot of these schemes. And particularly, for example, in the ACT scheme, they were very explicit about being additional to the poor ambition at the federal level. The Victorian renewable energy target was in part about the fact that you know, there was a sort of cliff coming towards the end of there was actually a lot of political uncertainty around the Warburton review, if you remember that. That was a federally led review of the national energy target, and that was actually one of the sort of drivers behind having a state-based scheme, because there was a huge degree of uncertainty around what the federal scheme was doing at the time. Yes, that should be Queensland, not Victoria. But yeah, so you sort of have these state-led actions to effectively address, I guess, not market failure, a political failure to institute some kind of credible climate policy at the federal level. Then we get to the sort of Act 2, which is post the South Australian blackout, or system black event. Now, this was unfortunately, I guess, a response. It was a political response driven by basically the state and federal interaction. Now, I guess it's important to note that the federal government actually doesn't have much jurisdiction over energy policy. Constitutionally, it sits with the states. It's a residual power, I think it's called. And in terms of what the federal government can actually do within the, I guess the electricity market it's somewhat limited. And because of this, partly because of the politicization and the sort of bashing that occurs between the federal energy minister and the state energy minister, Tom Koutsantonis, the South Australian energy minister, really had no other option other than to really go it alone, because he was effectively, from how I read the situation, backed into a corner to do something, because he'd been being criticised from all dimensions. And these particular things, these are just some of the things that were sort of done. But this marked, I can remember when they were when they actually purchased, or said they were going to purchase these gas generators, that in my mind marked a very significant marking point, because it was the first time, it was the first time in a long time that a state government had actually committed to buying generation assets. Just in the history of the national electricity market, it was largely state electricity commissions and largely government-owned assets in the past, and it went through a period of deregulation and liberalisation and privatisation. And then the idea was that a lot of or the new generation would be built by private enterprise. Now, that has largely been the truth, particularly in the southeastern states. We had Walt Lake Power Station built in Victoria by Origin, and a few other sort of peaking generators. But having a state government building a generator, spending, I think it was something in the vicinity of $300 million on a generator in South Australia, in my mind, was a sort of a very interesting intervention at the time. And then, there was a couple of other things. I mean, there was obviously the battery as well, and and then there was some additional emergency powers given to the state minister as well. But these are very, very much state interventions, purchases by the state government. It's a very sort of different approach to the market-led system. Now, following on from that, and it's all sort of difficult to know exactly what the motivation was here, but the Snowy 2.0 project was announced about 2 weeks after the battery project, and it's hard to it's hard to not see that this was sort of a game of one-upmanship at the time. And it's sort of a particularly interesting thing now, because now, I think earlier this year, was it earlier this year? I've forgotten now. The Commonwealth actually purchased outright the rest of Snowy 2.0 from the states. So New South Wales owned about 60% of it, Victoria about 30%, and the federal government owned 10%. And now they've purchased. They bought out Victoria and South Australia. So now the Commonwealth actually owns one of the, it's now the 4th largest gentailer. Now that's a fairly interesting position to be in, particularly at a time when we're talking about the National Energy Guarantee and guaranteeing reliability. The Snowy system was actually a potentially large beneficiary of the reliability obligation. And just even more recently, they're talking about price controls and you know, basically default tariff offers on a federal level, which is also an interesting position to be in, seeing as they are actually the fourth largest gentailer. I think it's Red Energy and Lumo. I've forgotten the name, or Simply. There's two fairly large retailers that are actually part of the Snowy business. So we've gone from this sort of, you know, selling off all the state assets, selling off all these assets to private enterprise. You know, the whole deregulation, privatization, etc. And now the Commonwealth is actually a big owner. You know, I suspect if they had their way, they'd probably privatise it as soon as they could. But at the moment, it is actually the Commonwealth, the federal government is a large player in the electricity market, in a sense. Then you also have the battery of the nation idea from Tasmania. Tasmania is also a state-owned. It's Tas Hydro is a state-owned generator as well. So yeah, you sort of have these. It's a bit. I mean, it's the response to the South Australian situation was very much, I guess, emergency response, or you know, that was the narrative that they had to do something. These ones, it was a less clear cut and a much more, in my mind at least, a much more overt intervention. In like, there's still a lot of contest about the business case around the Snowy 2.0, and you know, whether it is a good investment or not. But the idea that the federal government is stepping in to do this is still a very novel, or it's a very new development in the history of the NEM. Okay, so just as an aside, we'll just quickly go into ACCC recommendation 4. Now, this is the one that has got the sort of most, the most interest, I guess, from the media and the politicians. Basically, the idea is that the government, the federal government again, will basically underwrite or write offtake agreements to underwrite new generation. And they've put some rough numbers around that, and yeah, for an offtake agreement for 6 to 15 years. So it's got some specific recommendations around this. This is not all of them. This is just a couple of them, but it has to have 3 customers, not involve existing retail or wholesale markets. I think they said wholesale participants. I think it was about 10%. If you had more than 10% of the market share, you can't participate. And this one is the one that most people were interested in because of this word here, be capable of providing firm products. So that was sort of interpreted by some to mean baseload coal, which is not actually what they say at all. And it's kind of an interesting recommendation that actually, I wasn't going to talk about this, but I'll just quickly show you this diagram from, it's a typical retail hedge book for, companies that sign. So when you're building a new power station, you want like a 15-year sort of power purchase agreement. Now, in terms of that's what the project developer wants. In terms of what a retailer or a customer can generally sign, it looks more like this. So you have this mismatch between what a customer is able to sign, whether that's a small retailer or a large business, like even a commercial load, won't be looking to sign much more than 3 to 5 years. And then the 15 years to actually build a new asset. So the idea of having this underwriting that only starts from that sort of 5 years out is in a way to get around this issue, or at least underwrite the risk that exist out into the future. But it's still semi-market led in that there still needs to be customers. Customers have to sign the first few years. Now, it's not a bad way, in my mind at least, it's not a bad way to solve this mismatch. The other way that this mismatch has been solved is by vertical integration. This is, I think in 2003 or 2004, AGL, so strictly speaking, or originally, the system was not supposed to be vertically integrated at all. And it was a high court case between AGL. I think they were trying to purchase Loy Yang or some of Loy Yang A or Loy Yang B, I can't remember. But basically this is part of the same challenge that they were facing, basically financing assets that have a very long horizon versus having a very short-term position in terms of their retail load. But yeah, so that's sort of where this is coming from. But this is the next potential, as I see it, for political intervention as well. Now, you might have seen the member for Dawson was very quick off the mark in a couple of hours after the leadership spill to basically say looking forward to building a new baseload coal power station. Now, even though the ACCC recommendation doesn't say anything about this, I think they may have said something around using the Clean Energy Finance Corporation or some similar mechanism, or people have proposed that at least to sort of operationalize this recommendation. That sort of necessarily implies there's going to be some degree, there's going to be some process or some mechanism in place that will support something. That means there will be lobbying and political, I guess, involvement in determining what that something is. Now, it's not necessarily bad. I think it'd be very challenging for them to actually finance a coal-fired power station, but there's still going to be some kind of political involvement in defining what this particular facility will be able to underwrite. I mean, even if it's still some kind of political intervention. Okay. This was the other one that I think is quite interesting, because this one came up only like about 2 days or a day or two before the policy was actually dumped. They were going to, have a default market offer for electricity prices. The federal government was going to somehow going to do that, but that's actually not really. I think there was a couple of them said, "Oh, we're going to do what we did to the gas market to the electricity market. Come in with a heavy hand and regulate, or something like that." The big difference is we export gas, and the federal government has jurisdiction over export of energy, so they can intervene in the export industry around gas. They can't do the same sort of thing. Well, they'd have to be very creative with how they do the same sort of thing in the electricity space, because that actually sits with the states. And that's why we have groups like the Essential Service Commission of Victoria, IPART, ESCOSA. That's their job. And if they try to do something like this as they have talked about it, which they probably won't, then they'll be running into constitutional issues or jurisdictional issues. But all of this aside, I think it's quite an interesting, change to go from a sort of essentially a party that's probably been the champion of developing this liberalised electricity market to now talking about having basically a return to regulated electricity prices and state-owned, the state underwriting new generation assets at the same time as building Snowy. There's all of these things that are basically completely inconsistent with the idea of what a liberalised electricity market should look like. So this is, I guess, it's a sort of pointing to what, a more, I don't know if this is, I'm not saying this is a good or a bad thing, but this is a thing that is happening. We're sort of moving sort of quietly towards, or at least that's what the discussion is about, a re-regulation and a re-centralisation of the power system. But yeah, I guess the ACCC recommendation is a little bit more market-led than some of those other interventions that I talked about, but there's still scope within that for political intervention or interference. So that's sort of the high-level politics, or the politics writ large. There's also some interesting politics between the Australian Energy Market Commission and the Australian Energy Market Operator. There's sort of institutional politics that's happening here. And I think there's a few things that can be, I'm just going to talk particularly about two things. One is reliability, and the other is the Reliability Emergency Reserve Trader mechanism, which historically we have a very particular historic way of looking at these concepts. And the market operator has sort of taken a very different approach to these, or started talking about a very different measure of reliability. And that's a change, and it's a change that could have significant costs. So this was in the papers last Friday, and there's a 1 in 3 chance of blackouts next summer in Victoria, 1 in 10, I think, in South Australia. But so just out of curiosity, does anyone know what that actually means? A 1 in 3 chance of blackouts? Yeah. So like at a high level, you could say, whoops, does that mean, my house is out for 10 minutes? Does that mean a suburb is out for an hour? Does that mean a smelter is off for half an hour? Like, what does 1 in 3 chance of blackouts actually even mean? Like, it really has no measurable value. So the concept we use in Australia is something called unserved energy, or expected unserved energy, I think I should say. Expected is very important. And this is actually what it says about, it's basically, it's a measure of the amount of energy that might expect it to be not delivered in a given year. Now, that's a bit, so what's the standard is 99.998% or 0.002%. So basically it's saying that we want our system to deliver 99.998% of the energy that is demanded by customers. Now, historically, we've done much better than that, but that is a sort of a trade-off that we've historically accepted as reasonable. If we wanted to go more than that, it would cost a lot more. And if we want to go less than that, then maybe that'll be too many blackouts and people will get upset by it. So this is what they're projecting, just like, I guess, what they're thinking over the next few years, what the expected forecast unserved energy is, and we're actually below the reliability standard. Now, sure, we might want to have more reliable energy than that. That's fine. If we decide as a society we want to do that, but it's actually an expensive exercise to go above that. So this next chart is actually what this sort of semi-redefinition of what reliability is. So there's always a probability of a blackout. You can't have zero probability of a blackout. And so what this chart shows is the probability of a particular amount of unserved energy that they're forecasting. Now, it's not really, it's sort of like, so to say there's a 1 in 3 chance of a blackout is strictly true. Or there's 1 in 3 chance of unserved energy is strictly true based on their approach to measuring this. But it sort of doesn't, that's not what our reliability standard is. If we want to make that our reliability standard, that's fine, but that will come with costs. And I don't think people are actually prepared to actually pay more for increased reliability, particularly at the moment. If you want to know more about that, it's a bit into the weeds. Come talk to me afterwards. Or I wrote a bit of a conversation article about that as well. But yeah, so one of the I guess consequences of this focus on reliability, or this increased caution around reliability, is that last summer the market operator sort of used something called the reliability emergency reserve trader called the RERT, and it used a variety of different demand side response. I think there was some diesel generators put down in Morwell. There was a whole heap of things put in place. Now, that has been described at that cost, one particular event, I think it was in January or so, cost a fortune in terms of, if you've looked at the amount of energy that was avoided versus the amount that was paid. Now, maybe that's a reasonable cost for the system, but that's not for me to decide, I guess. But there's, I guess, the counterpoint of this is that the market at these conditions, if that didn't happen, it's quite like, well, it's according to, I guess, the counterfactual of, if those things didn't happen, the market would have actually been fine. So it's actually a cost that's been put onto the system to basically be more cautious and more risk averse, and it wasn't actually needed if in terms of you actually look back on the actual prices, the actual availability of generation, and all of the other, I guess, indicators. It was actually an unnecessary cost. So it is not without cost, this sort of extra drive or extra caution around reliability. Okay, just quickly, I'm not sure what time we've got. Yeah, okay. I think I originally said the good, the bad, and the ugly. I actually have a lot of trouble thinking about the good of the NEG. This was a thing that Alan Kohler said in the Australian a couple of weeks ago, and I couldn't put it better myself. That's pretty much the only good thing about the NEG was the potential for some kind of political agreement or some kind of compromised position, and we've seen how that's played out. I mean, yeah, I guess there's always this idea of bipartisan support for climate policy and ending the climate wars, which I think is actually rubbish, partly because, I mean, all of the uncertainty around around climate mechanisms has got nothing to do with the mechanism. It's all got to do with the target. So, you know, if you look at the renewable energy target, we had that big review, you know, in 2014, and that wasn't about the mechanism of the renewable energy target. That wasn't like, you know, we've got to change the registry, the LGC registry. That was about the target. That was always about the target. And basically you had Abbott who wanted to have no target, and you had Labor who wanted to have the existing target, and there was a compromise position at the end. The same thing I think is true of this idea of ending the climate wars. You've got, I don't know, the Greens want to have 90% emissions reductions by 2030. Coalition, I don't know what they want to do anymore, maybe nothing. So regardless of what the mechanism is, there's still going to be the sort of, this climate war is not about the end result, it's about the speed. It's about the costs and who pays them and the distribution of effects of that transition. So in terms of that war, it's, in my mind, it's all about speed, and it's got nothing to do with, you know, having a mechanism in place is not going to end the climate wars from my perspective. The bad, so I mean, there's lots of bad things about the NEG, or lots of things I didn't particularly like about the NEG. There's sort of some, I guess, process stuff that was pretty ordinary, particularly around how the Energy Security Board was basically politicised by the federal government, because, you know, particularly in the early days, it was very, well, even towards the end, it was very much taking its sort of directions from the federal government, and it is technically supposed to be a body that reports to the COAG Energy Council. So, you know, if you have a look at some of the sort of decisions they've made and some of the options that they put forward, they are very much not in line with what the state's interests were at the time. And in fact, they actually, I think the original NEG design, I can't remember this exactly, there was actually a period where basically at a COAG Energy Council meeting, they actually had to basically explicitly put in writing that the COAG Energy Council the Energy Security Board wouldn't do anything without the COAG Energy Council's approval, because they had basically been taking their orders from the federal government, and that pissed off a lot of people. Yeah, I mean, the consultation and the actual process behind it was, you know, if you look at similar exercises, you usually have broad consultation, you have stakeholder workshops, you have lots of, you know, if you compare it to, say, compare it to Finkel, if you compare it to the Climate Change Authority's electricity policy stuff, if you compare it to any attempt at this in the past, it's a fairly bespoke approach. And yeah, of course, the modelling, you know, again, if you want to go into the weeds on that, I'm very happy to talk about that later on. It's horrendous. Okay, and so that's, there's also these sort of other uglier parts about reliability again. Coming back to reliability, So these two I put in because these were put in after the COAG Energy Council meeting, and they were effectively, I thought it was funny that these were put in a couple of days after they were supposedly supposed to sign off on this policy. But basically these are actually quite, the reliability obligation itself is actually quite a significant change to how we think about reliability. We have the report I spoke about earlier on, the Electricity Statement of Opportunities, doesn't have any it doesn't have any, I guess, authority. It provides information to the market participants to be able to, make their decisions about what they might want to invest in. One of the big changes to this, with this reliability obligation and the trigger, the so-called trigger for the reliability obligation to come into effect, was actually basically making this document an instrument of regulation. So that would actually become something that you would have to comply with, or it would be used in the compliance process. That's a big change, going from an organisation that's a company that is an operator, actually basically being a part of the compliance regime. That's actually a big sort of, in my mind at least, that's a fundamental change to the historical separation between the regulator, the operator, and the commission. And yeah, so there's these trigger points, there's these extra, essentially extra power to AEMO, but also extra power. Well, this was proposed by South Australia for a jurisdiction to trigger these arrangements, which is particularly problematic because historically, this is exactly where we get overbuilding and gold plating, is when politicians or particular jurisdictions try to, basically there's a mismatch between their the costs, or, who pays the costs, and their political fortunes, or the benefits of having a highly reliable system. So yeah, the NEG is dead, but it's still warm, and this part of it is not as dead as the other part. It might still go ahead. So I actually, I don't know, but it's I'd be a bit reluctant to say that it's going to proceed in any form at the moment, but this is still very much an active part of the discussion, and certainly AEMO is keen for this to be operationalised. So I guess that just as this is just some comments, I guess, around all of these particular. I don't necessarily agree with what I've written here necessarily, but it's at least some thoughts about what all of these interventions and political and institutional interventions actually mean for the market. Perhaps for political reasons, because we value reliability, because we have problems with price spikes, maybe the energy-only design, which requires high price spikes, it's a feature of the market to have high price spikes, and that they seem to be politically unpalatable. And so you have attempts by whether it's states or the operator to essentially work around these, which then undermines the functioning or the good functioning of that particular market. There's also a sort of an interesting question about, has it ever actually worked? In terms of actually building new capacity. So this is a figure from Tim Nelson from AGL, a paper a couple of years ago. Can't see the columns that well, but it's basically new investments since the start of the NEM. There was a period at the start of the NEM where there was a bit of capacity built from non incentivized generation, let's say. There was a coal plant, a couple of coal plants, or one coal plant in Queensland, Milliman, and a couple of, I think, OCGTs and CCGTs. I think that might be Pelican Point and Tallawarra, maybe. But basically, since about 2003, everything that's been built in the NEM has been incentivised by some kind of policy, whether that's or state-owned generation. So Cogan Creek was also built. That's here. That's a coal plant that was built by the state-owned generator. But pretty much everything in the last 15 years has basically been either a peaking capacity, or a small gas engine or gas turbine, or it's been incentivized by green schemes or renewable energy targets or whatever you want to call it. So there is a sort of a legitimate question about, this market was brought into effect when the system was over capacity. And maybe it's basically just operated as a an overs and unders kind of market, or a balancing market over that time. It's actually, something I'm keen to look at in more detail is actually how effective has this been at encouraging new generation. Yes, so this is, I'm not really sure what the long-term implications of this are, and it's not to say that this design is good or bad, or whether this re-centralization is good or bad, but it's just something that I think we should think about in terms of, we have this idealized market structure that is so far removed from what is actually happening sort of on the ground. So yeah, it could work, but maybe the politics of it are too difficult to make it actually properly work. And yeah, we, I guess, need to just be a bit more thoughtful about, or need to be aware of this, the implications of these interventions and how they'll play out, what they'll cost. And yeah, that's all I've wanted to say, really.
Thanks, Dylan. I'm going to exercise my right to ask the first question.
Mm-hmm.
So it took quite a long time for the phrase gold plating to get into the lexicon. People were talking about it. It was dismissed quite a bit until, I think actually during Gillard's term, one day she got up and said, and brought it into the public discussion. And gold plating, building part, we've only ever used it to date in the transmission distribution system, building infrastructure that we arguably don't need, or building it to a standard above what we need, and creating a nice revenue stream for those who build and operate it. So if we've had it in the transmission distribution system, is there an argument that the South Australian power plant, the generators, and even the Tesla battery were themselves a form of gold plating?
Certainly in the case of the gas, well, it hasn't been used, I guess. That comes back to the point about it's the risk. It was the risk of a blackout or load shedding that incentivized the state government to put that in. I guess one thing that is a lot different in the case of in the case of that particular investment is that it comes out of consolidated revenue. So the state is paying for it, and it's theoretically being funded through relatively progressive tax measures. If it was in the case of the poles and wires and it's a regulated asset base, it comes through your bill as a bid on your charge, which is a highly sort of progressive form of recovering the cost. So there is, I guess, there's better distributional impacts of doing that through state-owned generation compared to putting a levy on your electricity bill. But yeah, it's still, that the whole idea of having these high price spikes and of energy only market is so that the risk of reliability or blackouts and having adequate supply sits with the private sector. So it's for them to make a decision around what assets they will build, because they are the ones that will end up bearing the cost. When the state government decides to do it, they are taking the risk on behalf of everyone, and they are, and this is, I think I talked about the mismatch between their risk tolerance and who pays. So with a private company that comes in, they'll put in the asset, and they are taking all the risk of that, whether or not that's needed or not. Because if it's not needed, they're going to do their dough. Sort of like what happened with Origin's Malt Lake plant. They came and built that at a time when volatility was increasing, and then basically after that, the volatility just disappeared. Demand started falling for a few years, and they didn't do so well on that. But in the case of South Australia, the South Australian government is taking the risk on behalf of all of us. They've got a higher, I guess, incentive to take on that risk because they don't want to have a blackout when there's an election in March. But everyone else pays. So.
Questions from the floor? So if people can give their name and affiliation, that'd be really handy.
Hi, Kate Griffiths from the Grattan Institute. Thanks so much for an excellent overview. I guess what I wanted to draw you out on a bit more is, I take your point about political interventions. There's a sort of, there's a political reality, I guess, we have to accept in terms of emergency responses after a blackout, for example, in the South Australian situation. But do you think we need political intervention to resolve that kind of long-term investment issue? So you've showed the retail hedge book, the sort of 6 to 15 years-ish after that. Do you think ultimately that is a responsibility of governments? And how do you see it sort of playing out? Like, if, say we had a change of government at the next election, and we see a sort of a new energy and climate change policy come in, and perhaps a more stable setting, do you think investors will be jumping in? Predict the future, please.
Yeah. I guess, yeah, that mismatch that exists, that I am a fan of this ACCC recommendation precisely because of that, and because there is limited competition in the wholesale and retail space. In terms of whether it's required, I'd probably say it is, because I mean, I guess we know that we can know it is if we have a contestable retail market, because if we don't have a contestable retail, if we go back to, you know, Electricity Service Commission of Victoria, or, you know, some other, then we know with a very high degree of certainty, or a much higher degree of certainty, what the load's going to be in 20 years' time. It's going to be, you know, what it is now plus 3%, or, you know, within a margin of error. If you're a retailer, you could lose all your customers next year, and so that because of that that fundamental mismatch, there is a role for government in intervening in that space, and I am actually quite a big fan of that ACCC recommendation for that reason. But it's sort of more the knee-jerk reactions that are, I think, more problematic. And yeah, it's because of that that fundamental mismatch between generation lifetimes and retail's business cycle that there is a need for political intervention. Just what shape that takes is very important. Yeah.
Thank you. To Roger next.
Thanks, Simon, and thanks very much, Dylan. Perhaps more of a comment than a question. Your final point about the whether the energy-only market is working or not. We've had declining demand since 2009. We've had a few coal-fired power stations retiring to kind of match that. So we really haven't had the need to build new generation. So to say that it's, for people who say it's not working because there's been no new investment, I don't think that's quite fair yet. But we're probably getting to the point now with Hazelwood departing and Liddell coming up soon that we actually don't have enough generation of certain types. And I've been very fortunate to work with Energy Australia as a consultant, looking at building a pumped hydro storage system. And they are investing millions of dollars at the moment in a full engineering design for that particular project. Now, it's not a generator per se because it's a storage system, but it will still fulfill a need in the market. And the decision on going forward on that is based on the market volatility. So the NEM at the moment actually is incentivizing Energy Australia to work in that space.
So I should stress, I don't actually think that the NEM is not working. It's just a question. There is a legitimate question about whether it is. Yeah, and I think a more accurate way of thinking about it, this might be the first time it's properly being tested, because we have had oversupply, we have had plants exit, we have had the RET bring forward new generation. Now we have just the market, or in theory, just the market, and we are seeing some projects come forward like that. What I think is going to be, what is different though, is building a peaking asset, whether it's storage or an open cycle gas turbine or whatever, reciprocating engines. AGL's doing reciprocating engine too. Well, they've got an active project in South Australia. That's fundamentally very different to building a new baseload plant, for want of a better word. And so, yeah, I mean, I'd be very surprised. Like, let's forget about economics for a second. Like, well, let's pretend coal was much cheaper than it is. I'd be very surprised, even in the current environment, if you could justify getting a 15-year project that has a high capacity factor, financing that based on the forward curve of electricity prices. Because I mean, a peaking asset, yeah, it's just a fundamentally different financing structure. So yeah, but yeah, I don't think it's not working, but I don't think it necessarily is working. It's just I mean, with all of these, the VRET, QRET, ACT scheme, it's, who knows?
Great, thank you. Actually got a question that's come in over the interwebs.
If Elias, can you hear us? You can ask your question now.
Okay, I think you were next there. Yep. Microphone coming.
Thank you. I'm a retired engineer. My name's David Wood. I served for a while on one of the boards of one of the generating companies, and I won't go further than that, if you don't mind. I would like to see the planet livable by my great-grandchildren and their followers. That's been my desire. We've stuffed up the world pretty well over the last 150 years. I think most people would agree with that. But all I'm hearing at the moment, and by the way, I came today to try and unravel the NEG because I don't understand it, but you've helped me at least to know what you think of it. And all I'm hearing from politicians and a number of other people is a race to see that they can lower the price of electrical energy. Now that really, really worries me. I may be wrong, but I cannot see how we, as a generation of people who are continuing to damage our climate through our actions, can lower prices of electrical energy. We shouldn't. And I'd like to hear more from authoritative organisations, and I think your organisation is one of those, as is the Grattan Institute. I'd like to hear more about why prices should be higher so that we can pay to get in a good position in 100 years' time. That's what I'd like to hear, but I'm not hearing it. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I guess I'd say, I mean, that's sort of an unfortunate reality, is that a lot of the stuff that is happening now is happening despite having climate policy. It's, all the renewable energy that's going in is not, we're not doing that because we've got, we've got a good carbon price, or we've had cost reduction. Like, I hate to know where we'd be now if the cost reductions we saw in solar and wind over the last decade didn't eventuate. Like, we'd be still, that would be a nightmare situation. And I guess, I mean, the situation is perhaps changed now so that going forward, prices might not necessarily be that much higher with a deep decarbonisation, because we have stupidly high electricity prices now. Like, it's over $100 a megawatt hour, or in that vicinity. Even if it might go a bit higher, but I can't imagine them really going a lot higher in the near term. But as I said, that's in spite of climate policy, not because of it. I guess, and that's one of the things I kind of get a bit frustrated with. Actually, Grattan has been pretty critical of the VRET and some of the solar schemes. The ACCC was critical of the solar schemes as well. And it's sort of a bit of a, it's sort of the idea of efficiency and competition is somewhat disposable, right? So if you talk about efficiency and competition in the context of the NEG, it's like, well, that's horribly inefficient, but it's a political compromise, right? So that's the sort of narrative. But then if you talk about the VRET, which is exactly the same thing, it's not the most economically efficient thing, but that is not, for some reason, that is not an appropriate compromise. So there's sort of a mismatch between what is acceptable, as being inefficient, and what is actually possible politically, which is, depending on what your argument is, you can just, deploy that efficiency and competition argument wherever you particularly like it. I guess the flip side of this is to say, well, okay, if we don't have these policies, we need to have a high carbon price, like $100 a tonne plus carbon price. We don't have that. So if you start talking about fairness and efficiency in the context of a system that doesn't have that, it's a completely meaningless conversation. So yes, these particular policies may not be that efficient if you're looking at a system that has really high really high emissions. If you say, okay, let's put an arbitrary $100 a tonne carbon price on, maybe these policies aren't that inefficient and they're actually politically palatable. So there's a bit of a trade-off there. But yeah, I mean, in terms of, we've seen the problems, I guess, of the political problems of trying to introduce carbon prices. So in the meantime, I'm quite happy with things like the VRET and solar policies.
Our next question, we're going to try again with the internet question from Natasha.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Hi, Dylan. Just going back to the discussion about encouraging new generation, can you tell us a bit about what is the role of the AEMC and the AER in encouraging new generation in the system, and why have they not been successful in this without having policy intervention?
Okay, so the role of the AEMC is a bit arcane in that, so that one of their functions is to set the reliability standard, or they have a reliability panel that sets, it has two functions. They set things like the market price cap, and through that, if the market was left untouched and unintervened with, that price cap that they determine should encourage more generation. So I can't remember how often they do it. They probably do it every 3 or 4 years, I think. They'll basically reevaluate what so at the moment we have a $14,200 price cap in the wholesale electricity market. And that is partly determined, it is determined through this process that the AEMC does. And basically the idea behind that process is that the last generator that is needed to meet the reliability standard can earn enough money to be financially viable. That's the sort of principle behind how they come up with they do this whole bunch of Monte Carlo simulations, work out what the last generator required, revenue is required for it to be financially viable, and then that's what the price cap is. That's how they've sort of, that's their role, I guess, in incentivizing new generation. The Australian Energy Regulator doesn't really have any role in that so much. They just enforce the rules. So there's, the AEMC makes the rules, including things like the price cap. The market operator operates the market and follows the rules. And the AER basically, within the wholesale market, I should say, the AER basically makes sure that everyone is following the rules. Well, that's what they're supposed to do. And they occasionally issue fines for people and that sort of stuff. But they don't really have a role in terms of incentivizing new generation, more making sure everyone's doing the right thing.
Great, thank you. And our last question, I think, because we're right up against 12 o'clock now. Alan, please.
Alan Pearce from here and from RMIT. I wanted to come back to this issue of the reliability and pricing and the design of the market, because people might know I do a lot on the demand side, and the thing that I think is driving a lot of politicians is the fact that people don't want electricity. Electricity is an input into them maintaining their production or maintaining their lifestyle. Yep. And so when you start talking about, you know, extremely high short-term prices, or more importantly, blackouts or unserved energy. Essentially, the real cost to a business is the loss of production, which is like 30 times the price of energy.
Yep.
And to my mind, this is the interesting thing. I haven't heard anyone in the energy debate talking about this issue, that people don't want energy. They want to keep running their systems. And so we see people do place a high value on reliability, but in a sense, they don't want to pay for it.
Yep.
But when it's gone, the politicians know all about it.
I mean, that's certainly the case with the aluminium smelters. You know, they have fairly good contracts that you know, sort of below, you know, the low price, and then they occasionally get turned off every now and again, and they make a lot of noise about that, but they've only got low prices the rest of the time because of that. I guess coming back to that what we're talking about with the AEMC and the setting up a price cap, the historic, well, one of the fundamental, I guess, the theoretical reasons we even do that is because we don't have a good demand side. If we had a good demand side, you wouldn't have a price cap at all. And I'd love to see that, like, you know, get rid of it entirely, because there's a few things that actually, some few inefficiencies are caused by having a price cap. One of them is that people, it's sort of like a tacit point for collusion and a few other theoretical problems. But if you had a properly functioning demand side, you could get rid of it entirely. And I suspect it would probably be a lot less than $14,200 per megawatt hour. But yeah, until we have a good demand side, we're sort of stuck with this particular system. But yeah, there's certainly a lot more. There's a lot of scope and there's a question about what does reliability mean actually when you're talking about demand side response as well, because it's not then meeting demand; it's meeting demand at a price, or, you know, you're having a demand curve as well as a supply curve. So yeah, but the demand side is, I certainly agree, is very, very underlooked or overlooked, I should say, in this debate. And there's a lot of potential there, you know, in terms of addressing some of these reliability challenges.
Thank you very much, Dylan, for your talk. I was thinking, as you're saying that last bit, that perhaps with this this period where the federal government is almost certainly going to take a step back from energy policy, it's an opportunity for real experts to start doing the work that has to be done, and maybe maybe we can actually get some reform done in the outside of the political lens. That's at least a deep wish. Hopefully we can make that happen. Thank you very much, Dylan. The slides are already online, which is great, and I'm sure Dylan's very active in getting back to people on questions. So I'm sure there'll be lots of conversations that will come out of this. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you, Dylan, for a really interesting presentation.
Thanks. Oh, shit. Just before you all go, we've got a couple of more seminars coming up. So next Monday, Beyond Zero Emissions is it's got a preview of their electrifying industry summit. That's in the Cumming Theatre in the chemistry section of the university, in the chemistry building. And then this time next week, we have Penny Wetton talking about dealing with uncertainty, reflections, and the role of projecting regional climate change. Thanks.